some very either potential or demonstrated side effects to this that would be very much unwanted. And so I would just reduce my comments to those and hope they're helpful to you. I should also say the one thing that's been shown very effective with combustible smoking to decrease its use has been taxation in every country that it's been used. Increase in taxes decreases usage.
Go to the panel for questions. Any questions?
Sure.
Representative Chasey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Nitzkin, what regulations do you support on tobacco products or e-cigarettes?
Well, I separate tobacco products from e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes, while legally in terms of the federal jurisdiction for regulation are defined as tobacco products, they contain no tobacco. They contain nicotine extracted from tobacco. So I would recommend, from the legislative point of view, if part of your goal is enhancement of the health of the public, that anything you can do in your power to restrict the use, inhibit the use of combustible tobacco products, especially cigarettes, you should do. And there is absolutely no bar on, trying to reduce that as much as possible. When it comes to e-cigarettes, the question is, what are the public health implications? Well, for users of combustible tobacco products to switch, there is enormous reduction in risk. So that is a major public health benefit. The public health disbenefit would be, if they substantially reduce. That is another area where the tobacco control advocates have not been telling the truth. Cutting down on cigarettes from a pack or 2 pack a day to 5 cigarettes a day will not reduce the cardiovascular risk, but that's 40% of the deaths. So in that context, no, there will not be a reduction in risk. But the other 60% is lung disease and cancer, and those are very dose dependent. If you cut down to a quarter of the cigarette consumption, you're eliminating 3/4 of the lung disease and cancer risk. So that's misleading. So the fear about e-cigarettes is that they will recruit non-smoking teens and non-smoking adults to nicotine use. And we have the data to show that that simply is not happening. So the fear isn't there. So in terms of taking a look at the e-cigarette, I would consider it in a category similar to the pharmaceutical gums and patches. They basically serve the same purpose. If you take a look at the e-cigarette data within the e-cigarette industry, 90% of it or more is smokers using it to cut down and switch. So in your minds as legislators, I would deal with cigarettes here and e-cigarettes there, with the idea that anything you do to restrict e-cigarette use may increase smoking. Now, we agree, despite the one paper that I presented, that imposing age restrictions on e-cigarettes is a good thing to do. I would go one step further and impose the same age restriction on sales of the pharmaceutical nicotine products.
So you're not opposed to all regulation? You're not opposed, Mr. Chairman, to all regulation?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
It sounded like you were pretty libertarian in that view.
No, no. The organization that supports me here recognizes the value of government regulation to protect health and the environment, but objects to when government takes steps that are not justified on that basis. And so I think that the important regulation you have in place, the child-proof containers and the restrictions on sale, that we agree on. But
I would, Mr. Chairman, Doctor, I would dispute your claim that somehow we make them more attractive to you by regulating them. Did you say that or not?
no, what I said is that this investigator, this one research paper,
Which one?
if you will refer to the Friedman paper, which is slide number 9 on the top of page 5. She examined smoking rates by teens in states that had prohibited sales of e-cigarettes to persons under 18 compared to states that had not imposed such bans. And she found that imposing the ban on sales to persons under 18 actually increased smoking in those states. It's not my feeling, my recommendation, it's her research finding.
Oh, I see. So is this a juried publication?
Yes. So it says that even when you do the right thing, there may be some adverse consequences. But that is not strong enough in my view to lift the prohibition on sales. The issue with teens is a little different than adults because there's issue of actual brain damage.
And so, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Nitzkin, would the R Street Institute be opposed to taxation then on e-cigarettes?
Well, I'm the person who advises R Street on what their policy should be. They don't tell me what their policy is and advocate it. But when you're dealing with the issue of taxation on e-cigarettes, rather than model it on tobacco cigarettes, I would model how you tax e-cigarettes on how you tax the pharmaceutical gums, patches, lozenges, and inhalers. Because they basically serve the same protective purpose for smokers in terms of reducing their risk of tobacco-related illness.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Doctor, that wasn't their goal. I mean, it's not like somebody came up with the idea, let's help more people quit smoking.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that was their goal. That was the original.
Make money?
Everybody in this business is making money, especially the pharmaceutical companies. You can't accuse them of being altruistic. But they saw a market niche, given the fact that we have these millions of smokers and millions of deaths worldwide. The smoking cessation pharmaceuticals have been remarkably ineffective. The vast majority of smokers who've turned to e-cigarettes have done it after trying and failing to quit on the pharmaceuticals. So they see as their marketplace all these smokers who would like to quit but have been unable to do so. And, quite frankly, yes, make money by doing so. Their goal is not, nor has it ever been, recruiting new people to cigarette addiction, because the cigarette marketplace is so huge and the e-cigarette niche is so small that they've got everything they need in that community of smokers in terms of profit potential.
Okay, and who is Peter Sandman?
Peter Sandman,
My reception's not very good. I was trying to Google him.
If we may, you might want to address,
you've,
please keep the comments to the chair and to the panel as well, so that
okay, certainly,
and
Mr.
the
Chair.
answers as well.
Yeah.
if you will.
And this is, he's the author of one of the articles.
Yes, he is the, Mr. Chair, Representative Chasey. Peter Sandman is the person that the people at CDC and everyone else has looked to guide them in risk communication, especially when you're dealing with environmental and toxic exposures. How do you communicate to the public in such a way that they understand what you're saying and understand what they should or should not be doing in response to this exposure to a toxin, and there's always lots of unknowns. How do you deal with that? That's his expertise.
Okay, I have no more questions, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shorter? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, I want to make sure I've got your quote right, that the only way to get to no cigarettes is to eliminate nicotine ingestion devices. Is that your quote?
No, my quote was, the only way to get to zero risk is total abstinence from nicotine.
Okay, great, that's even better. And would you agree that nicotine is a dangerous, deadly, addictive substance?
No, Mr. Chair. Nicotine in and of itself is not very addictive. Cigarettes are hugely addictive, largely because of the combination of the nicotine and other substances in cigarette smoke which enhance the addictive potential. And basically the evidence for that is the fact that the pharmaceuticals that are intended to get people off cigarettes are basically straight nicotine without those other substances. Nicotine in and of itself is not deadly unless you get to doses thousands of times higher than you see in cigarettes. Nicotine does present the risk of some brain damage to teens and adolescents. That's a major reason for prohibiting their sales. And also to the unborn baby when used by pregnant women. But those are not fatalities. Nicotine is not that toxic.
Okay. Dr. Larsen, what is your take on nicotine in and of itself?
Well, a couple of things. The first is that I gave staff 2 recent publications that have been published in the last 60 to 90 days by the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a very reputable journal. It's one of the most reputable journals in the country. Both of those publications show that the use of e-cigarettes by teenagers demonstrates that it is a gateway to combustible smoking. And it is indeed true that nicotine will affect the brain development, particularly in teenagers and particularly in the unborn child of a pregnant mother. And so I think that makes it very clear that it has very significant health effects. In addition, there's very clear data that long-term use of nicotine can cause cardiovascular disease quite substantially. There are clearly additional health effects that are bad due to smoking a combustible cigarette, but that doesn't mean the nicotine alone is not bad. The other thing is, it's not clear. You have an alternative here that already works. The patch works for smoking cessation. It is not clear, it is not clearly demonstrated that an e-cigarette actually is effective in that way. And so I think that's an important point to consider as well. And thirdly, remember the liquid that the nicotine is in the e-cigarettes and what it's putting out into the air and what's being inhaled. The effects of that organic is not known. It's not water, it's an organic. And so when you don't know the effects of these, and it's not, and it's clear that there's a lot of smoke around this, meaning it might have fire, it seems to me the prudent thing is to restrict its use until such time that you would know more. And certainly taxation would dramatically or significantly alter its use.
And Dr.
And there would be no cost with it to cessation programs that already, because the patch is available.
And Dr. Larsen, did you say at our last meeting that there was a recent report showing that of the nicotine, of the e-cigarette users, 50% do go on to cigarettes?
I think
Did I
those
get that?
two recent studies, I think it's, one of them went over a year, and the two are, you'd have to look, the exact percentages are in the two papers I just went. But I think among teenagers, it was like 18% convert over a year to combustible smoking. And then I don't remember what the exact percentage was for adults.
Okay.
So it's in both of those things that I handed out from the Journal of American Medical Association. One's for pediatrics and one's for adults.
Okay, thank you. And so, sir, is it your testimony that there is no way that an e-cigarette can deliver as much nicotine as a cigarette?
No,
into
that
the
is
body?
not my testimony.
Okay.
My testimony was that the conventional wisdom in the tobacco control community is that no product could deliver as much nicotine as a tobacco cigarette, so that anybody who started using a lower risk product would then transition to tobacco cigarettes to get a bigger nicotine hit. We have, in fact, models of e-cigarettes, advanced models of e-cigarettes that deliver nicotine as well as a tobacco cigarette.
Right, I understand that. So there is a difference between the reports you cite and the reports that Dr. Larsen cites, that almost 19% go on to cigarettes, and you're saying that there's none.
Okay.
So let me ask one other question. Isn't it true that the whole idea of using a patch, which maybe should be a prescription event, I'm not saying it shouldn't, because hasn't the CDC determined nicotine is an addictive drug? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you disagree with that study?
Nicotine is addictive, but minimally addictive.
But it is addictive. And so we don't want children ingesting addictive drugs, right?
Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct.
Okay. So you would agree with a ban then, or with a policy that puts the patch and nicotine gums behind the pharmacy counter?
I would.
Yeah, okay. Because since I agree with that policy, I think that's where cigarettes belong also, because they deliver nicotine. So if nicotine is this dangerous drug that belongs behind the counter, but and can only be given out by a pharmacist, I do agree that that's where cigarettes belong. So let me move on to the next point then, that I understand there's this difference between, you two seem to be talking that there is organic matter that is the liquid part of an e-cigarette and particulates, which are especially prevalent in cigarettes. And I think Dr. Larsen is agreeing with you that there aren't the particulates in an e-cigarette that are in cigarettes. So, but that's only half of the investigation we should be doing, that we should know more about these organic matters that are in the liquid part of an e-cigarette before we advise people that it's a good thing to do instead of smoking cigarettes.
Mr. Chair, may I respond to those remarks?
Sure.
First of all, when we talk about particulate matter, the particulate matter from cigarette smoke is little tiny bits of tar. It's solid matter. The particulate matter from exhaled e-cigarette vapor is liquid particulate matter. It is, in fact, the organics in question. Now, with regard to those organics, the primary organic is propylene glycol. Propylene glycol has been used for decades as theatrical smog. It has been used in hospitals for air disinfection. It has been tested, with most of this testing being done basically in the 1930s and 40s, and found to have, at that time, no acute toxicity and no evidence of long-term toxicity. So we do, in fact, know a lot about these organics and every reason to believe that any health hazard at all is minimal and certainly nowhere near the risk posed by cigarettes. Now, in terms of the studies that show e-cigarette smokers moving on to cigarettes, the methodology, I'm familiar with the Premack study. In fact, I wrote a letter to the editor, which was rejected. But that's another whole story because they simply don't accept certain kinds of letters. The Premack study is based on experimentation, not continuing use. And basically what that study shows is that kids who are likely to experiment with one nicotine delivery product are also likely to experiment with others. So it shows that kids whose first experimentation with e-cigarettes also experimented with cigarettes. Doesn't indicate that it's a gateway to smoking. It's just a question of experimentation. And CDC has not proceeded, and those investigators in that study didn't even ask about continuing use. The people in London and UK did notice that phenomenon, did gather the data to separate continuing use from one-time experimentation, and their data show that it's just experimentation. E-cigarettes do not lead teens, e-cigarette experimentation does not lead teens to nicotine addiction through either continuing use of e-cigarettes or transition to tobacco cigarettes.
Dr. Larsen, did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to review the e-liquid issue. You know, I don't think you can really cite the studies from the 1940s on an acute use versus the use of really inhaling it directly into your lungs in an e-cigarette. There's really been no studies that have really looked at any sort of the effects on that or the secondhand inhalation of those products. Organics, that really is an unknown. The second issue is, look, these are scientifically reputable journals that have undergone scientifically rigorous review prior to publication. They also accept editorials. I've written many editorials in my life when I didn't like what was published and I might have criticized it. Those also are reviewed for their scientific merit. If they're not accepted, there's typically a reason for it. So what I would say is you've got scientific publications saying there is progression. I'd like to remind you in the marijuana debate, for 20 or 30 years, the same arguments were made that it was only low level of addictions. It didn't really have side effects that we know about. We now know that marijuana is indeed addictive. And we do now know that with continued use of marijuana, marijuana is to brain development what smoking is to cancer and cardiovascular disease. And so I think you have to be very careful in how you proceed on these sort of potential health issues.
Okay, thank you. I do know something about Peter Sandman, and I do know that he's been hired by the tobacco companies to do work for the tobacco companies. So it would seem to me that somebody that is actually paid by the tobacco companies who have financial interests, and I think now the testimony that was presented last year by the e-cigarette community is the tobacco companies now own about a third of the e-cigarette companies in America. I can't remember exactly what the number was, and maybe the folks in the next one could address that number, whatever it is. But somebody that is taking money from a group, I believe, is highly suspicious when we present them as, and their findings and their conclusions as to what we should believe or not believe in a relevant debate. So that gives me pause. So I don't know enough about Dr. or it is Abigail Friedman. In your thing here, you you don't list her as a doctor. You just say her name is Abigail S. Friedman. So I don't know what her credentials
She's
are.
a PhD economist.
Okay, she's an economist. Okay, and I don't know what the Journal of Health Economics is, although you've presented it now as a journal that has been scientifically juried. So it's supposedly a credible journal. So you don't disagree with anything I've just said. It is a
It is an
Jury.
accredited jury journal
Right.
in the field of economics.
The problem was and I forget the fellow's name, I think it began with an F. It was an Italian-sounding name of a man that had done some research in England last year that you mentioned to us last year in your presentation. And I went onto the internet and I found a cigarette advertisement that doctor had made for cigarette and e-cigarette smoking. And so his conclusions that you were presenting to us as the backbone of your research on why e-cigarettes were not dangerous, I found very disconcerting when, in fact, he was advertising the very products that he said he had done a survey and he was responsible for a research that, in fact, later on showed that he was receiving money for advertising those same products. So that worried me also. So it just seems to me that the research that I've done and what I know about the cigarette companies as they move into making money on e-cigarettes, they have a vested interest in making sure that we don't tax and we don't regulate e-cigarettes. But I don't find the cigarette companies credible as to what we ought to be doing as it relates to products that they, in fact, might also have a financial interest in making. For instance, one of the findings that came out of the 1990s court cases and disclosure of information from the tobacco companies is they were actually enhancing the amount of nicotine in their cigarettes, knowing that it was the nicotine that was so addictive that would habituate the users to their substances. So with that said, the other end of the coin is, was it your testimony, doctor, that you couldn't get as much nicotine out of an e-cigarette use during the day or in vaping as you would nicotine out of cigarettes?
Mr. Chair, the products that were available a year ago could not deliver as much nicotine as a tobacco cigarette.
Excuse me,
Technical-
you mean the commercially made ones that were pre-made with the typical e-cigarette as opposed to a vaping?
Mr. Chair, the Cigalite products, which you're referring to, the mass-marketed ones by the big tobacco cigarette companies,
Blue
do not-
Brown Company?
yeah, Blue, Mark 10, Views, those, do not deliver anywhere near as much nicotine as a tobacco cigarette. the vape shop industry is not the same industry as the big tobacco cigarette companies. They are a completely different, completely separate group.
I agree. I totally agree with that. I absolutely totally agree.
And so the fact that the big cigarette companies were found to be racketeering back in the 1990s should not be held against this other component of the industry, which has nothing to do with cigarettes. In fact, they hate the big tobacco cigarette companies probably even more than the public health folk do.
Well, Mr. Chairman, they were on the same side here last year, although I found that interesting because I know in Kansas, the cigarette companies are going after the vaping industry. And so I thought it was very suspicious that the vaping industry in New Mexico would align themselves with the big tobacco companies on the question of taxing nicotine, when in fact the big tobacco companies, I think, will do everything they can to suppress the vaping industry and to try to put them out of business or at least take them over is what I suspect is the end game there. Okay, so I think I've asked all the questions that I needed to ask. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for both your presentations. I found both very interesting. A lot of things to look into also. I am an engineer, by the way, and so I do believe data, but it's got to be credible data. And so, you know, looking at some of the data presented, you know, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again. When I took statistics, when I was going to college, which has been quite a few years ago, the first thing my statistics instructor said, and I want to reiterate it. She said, if you don't learn anything else in this class, learn this one thing: that liars do figures and figures do lie, and statistics is the means by which that is done. And I worked many years in test and evaluation in the scientific world, and I've seen a lot of figures misused. So it's going to be an ongoing debate. I appreciate the testimony of both. I don't think it's something we're going to solve today. I think more data is needed. I was particularly appreciative of the fact, Dr. Larsen, about the organic particles. You know, and having worked in the low light level area in my job before I retired, a lot can be said about the organic particles in the air and the harmful effects and so on and so forth. So I do appreciate that, and I noted that very clearly. So thank you both very much for your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pardon me?
If you have any questions, I'd be happy to.
Okay. We're going to have about a 5-minute pause to set up for the next presentation. So if any of you need to run out for a few minutes, then this will be a good time to do it. So give us about 5 minutes to get this next presentation set up, if you would, please. So.